Misogyny should be classed as a hate crime, according to a new report today from the Law Commission. The consultation said abuse women face because of their gender should be treated in the same way as other discrimination. Currently, the law protects people based on their race, religion, sexual orientation, disability and transgender identity. Let's speak now to Stella Creasy, who is the Labour MP for Walthamstow. She's led the calls for a change in the law and secured the Law Commission's review a couple of years ago. And also Aileen McKay, who is a writer and researcher who's personally experienced misogyny. Hello to both of you. Stella Creasy, first of all, how would you define misogyny?
Well, just as with any other form of hatred, there is a legal definition we've been looking at, which is about hostility based on the basis of simply who you are. So many women will tell you their stories have become so ingrained we don't realise that it's misogyny, about having to walk down the street late at night with their keys gripped in their hand in case somebody approaches them, about the abuse and violence that they face both on and offline. And it's hostility on the basis of just being a woman, of being who they are. Making misogyny a hate crime is about making sure that women can be as equally free as anyone else in society to be who they are without fear of harm.
So how do you react to this report from the Law Commission today, which recommends that it is made a hate crime?
Well, I welcome it. We've been working, it's a coalition of 26 different organisations as broad as Stonewall, but also Citizens UK, Refuge, Hope Not Hate, the Fawcett Society, Dimensions, organisations who work on hate crime, who all recognise that there's a gap in our law right now. And why I particularly welcome this proposal is that at the moment we ask women to choose a particular element of their identity if they're going to get taken seriously as a victim of hate crime. So if they are a Muslim or if they are a lesbian, this allows them to be seen as a victim in their own right without having to choose. And we know it works. In the 7 police forces that are already doing this around the country, it's changing the way in which hate crime is dealt with. It means that women are being believed and we're better able to detect and ultimately prevent these crimes.
But we already have legislation that protects people from harassment, from assault and so on. Why do we need this?
Well, the evidence tells us that recognising the motivation, and I must stress, this doesn't create any new crimes, but just as we recognise when somebody is motivated by racial hatred to attack people, so this recognises where people are motivated by their hatred of women to attack people, we can better detect those crimes and we can change the culture, because the reality is that women will tell you all too often when they come forward to report instances, people say, that's life. So it's not acceptable. It needs to change. We need to challenge these perpetrators so that everybody is free to be who they are without fear of being attacked.
So it's important that you point out it doesn't create a new crime. What it would allow courts to do is to consider it an aggravating factor when handing out sentences.
Yes, just as when we recognise and we say it's not acceptable for somebody to be abused because of the colour of their skin or their sexuality, so we would be able to say women shouldn't experience the abuse and harassment. And we know during lockdown that domestic violence and sexual harassment on our streets has soared. They shouldn't have to experience that, and we will send a very strong message through our courts, through our policing system, that it won't be tolerated. Rather than asking women to cope with this, society can change it.
Let me bring our audience in on this. This tweet says, I was called a lesbian and the C word for politely declining a date. Zoe says it's part of what women and girls are expected to accept as being female. Aileen McKay, what misogyny have you experienced?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting question because it involves actually narrowing things down and choosing just 1 or 2 incidents. But a few years ago, when I lived in Glasgow, I had an experience on a train around, I think, 8 in the evening, so really sociable hours, and a man had just got on at the last minute and he'd urinated down the side of the train, just really, really gross. And then he packed himself into the little vestibule area. And he proceeded to try and touch me completely inappropriately. I refused. I told him to back off. It was very clear, very firm. And he insisted. And as he was doing that, he was saying things like, oh, but you're beautiful. You're as beautiful as my daughter. Can't you take a compliment? And I was saying, well, no, this isn't a compliment. But he really didn't want to hear it. And then he immediately had the audacity to try and attempt to do the exact same thing to the woman who was standing next to me. And I blocked him from doing that as well. And actually at that point he kicked off and he said that I was causing a scene, and that I was sort of getting in his way from doing what he wanted to do. And his friends said that I wasn't entitled to say no to him. So as soon as I could, I escaped into the next carriage and made a report to the police when I got off the train. That was a fairly uncomfortable experience.
Yeah, and obviously there is legislation to protect you. It's sexual assault. What he was attempting to do was sexually assault you. What difference would it make if misogyny were added to that?
Yeah, I think this is really about what Stella's already said about taking things very seriously, about taking what happens to women and non-binary people seriously, because as it stands, even although I made a police report and the officers did take the situation seriously, which I think I actually have to partly credit to the fact that I have a fairly well-educated accent and I'm white, for example, even with all of those things on my side, it was still not enough to actually resolve the situation in any meaningful way. And this is a man who's now gone home to his family. We know he has a daughter, for example, presumably has a wife as well. And he's able just to keep living very freely. And in all honesty, I doubt that he remembers this scenario. So with this type of legislation perhaps on the horizon, I would really like to see space for men who do things like this to actually be stopped in the moment and to realise that what they are doing is not okay. And it goes beyond just the individual instance, because in the situation I've just described, I actually had about 10 witnesses and people who had watched what happened but did not intervene and didn't see the problem. So perhaps we're moving towards a culture shift that we desperately, desperately need, where we all take accountability for each other's safety and well-being in public spaces and private too.
Yeah, that's interesting. Stella Creasy, you will understand why I'm asking this. It's partly prompted by messages from our audience. Are you going to campaign for misandry to be made a hate crime?
Well, we've been looking at the evidence, and Aileen's story is a classic example of this, overwhelmingly, about how women are targeted for being women and what difference it makes to our ability to stop that if we start recording that data and treat it as seriously as we can. It is for other people to make the same case if they believe it exists for misandry, and the Law Commission is consulting on that. What I'm very focused on right now is the overwhelming evidence that women are at risk and that isn't recognised or treated as seriously as it should be, and so it continues to put women at risk. It's something for other people to look at. I'm very focused on that issue because the case is overwhelmingly there, and it's taken us 2 years to convince the Law Commission. If your listeners agree with us, then we started a campaign, #MyMisogynyStory, and a frame for them to tell their story, just as Aileen has so powerfully today, about the difference it would make. And I would encourage them to do so now, because that's what this consultation is about.
Aileen, you went to the police, you had witnesses, you did everything that you could do in that scenario. What would you say to women who are watching now who have experienced something similar? Or, I've had messages from women saying, I just walked to the shop and I get, comments from the blokes who are on a construction site. And that is not tarnishing every man who works on a construction site, because we know there's some really nice blokes who do. But what advice would you give to them?
I think that's actually a really nuanced question, because what it's tapping into is the idea of a so-called good victim. And like I mentioned earlier, I fit that remit perfectly. I'm white, I'm educated, I'm someone who made an in-depth report to the police, who felt able to do that, who felt confident enough to do that. And I was taken seriously, and the police did know that the train company had high-quality CCTV footage from the incident. So effectively, I ticked all the boxes, but it still wasn't enough. And I really want to get away from the idea that the onus is on women to report, to stand up to the people, the men who want to harass them, to attack them, and actually move towards something that's actually a lot more collectively responsible. So to any women who are watching this, or non-binary people too, I would say, if you are able, it's a really great thing if you can file a report, if you feel safe to do so with the police, because it allows us to get a more full picture of what's actually happening from a statistical perspective, which, as movements towards legislation show, we do need the facts and underpin that. But simultaneously, please do not feel guilty, do not feel bad, and do not feel pressured if that's something that you are just not able to do. It's enough that you just make it through the day and don't feel ashamed about what's done to you. That's okay too.
Fair enough, absolutely. And those witnesses, those other people on that carriage, would you have welcomed any one of them saying something?
Absolutely. And what I really want to say is it's not about sort of muscling in. I can handle the situation myself. I've got a mean right hook. I can look after myself. However, it is about not letting someone flounder alone when they're on the receiving end of harassment. So what was really interesting was when I reached my destination, one of the men who was next to me who had witnessed what happened, he was there with his girlfriend. And they came up to me and she was in floods of tears. And she was saying, I'm so, so sorry. I saw what happened, but I didn't feel safe to intervene. I was watching it. I knew you were being harassed. And I'm so sorry I couldn't do anything. And I reassured her and I said, of course, I totally understand why you couldn't. And he said, I'm so sorry because I saw what happened and I didn't know that I was looking at harassment.
Wow.
So in terms of intervention, actually, we've got work to do in letting people who currently have the privilege of not being on the receiving end of that harassment actually know what they need to be looking out for. And the best thing that you can do if you see someone being harassed is obviously register the safety of the situation first. Don't put yourself in danger. But the best thing that you can do is interact with the person who's on the receiving end of the harassment. And all that means is simply making eye contact with them, saying, are you okay? You can even do it without words. You don't need language to do this. And that lets them know that they're not alone. And you've put yourself in between the dynamic where the harasser is expected to be uninterrupted. And if you just put yourself in there, it's not a confrontation, but it is solidarity. And that's where it makes all the difference in the world. You can really diffuse a situation instantly like that.
Brilliant advice. Thank you very much, Aileen McKay. Thank you for coming on. Stella Creasy, thank you.